The last thing I want to talk about today, and something that'll be really important for Project Zero and indeed your entire future programming career, is using libraries. So one of the most amazing things about computer science is that any piece of code I write can be instantly sent to you and reused, and it doesn't matter how complicated it is. I can write a function that, for example, takes the human genome and simulates what the person's face looks like. In theory, that might be possible, and once I wrote it, I could just send that to you as a library, and you could just use it as a function and whatever you wanted to use it for, right? And that's something that is really one of the most amazing and cool things about being a programmer, right? Anything anybody builds, it's yours. So, you should learn how to take advantage of all the libraries people out there have written. So there's tons of things out there that people have written, and in this class, we're going to give you everything you need. We're not going to ask you to go find the appropriate library on the internet and use it, and in fact, we're going to ask that you don't. So the libraries that we're going to use include all those things like the built-in libraries. So the math class can compute square roots. The integer class can convert strings to integers, and so forth. And we're also going to use another big library known as the Princeton Standard Library I'll describe in a moment. We may add additional libraries for the later projects, but we'll have at least these. So as a programmer, you really want to use what's out there because it'll first save you the trouble of writing code, but secondly, that it avoids you introducing any kind of weird bugs. So there's all kinds of stories of people trying to write their own cryptographic libraries because they think, okay, well, I'm writing this program, so really I ought to be the one writing the key exchange code or whatever it may be. And you get some tiny little detail, some subtle little detail, and it really compromises your security. So if you use libraries that have already been tested and used by tons of people out there in the world, chances are it's going to be less buggy. I mean, it might not be. There have been major bugs in widely used pieces of software, but chances are you will do a worse job. Now the downside is you're going to have to spend some time learning how each of these libraries works, right? So it's sort of like the equivalent of when you first start programming. It's so tempting to write everything yourself. And I kind of liken it to, imagine you have a giant chunk of wood and you want to cut it in half. And you have a saw. So you know how a saw works. You go like this. And it gets chopped in half. And even if it takes you 2 hours or 2 days, you know you can get there. Now, the better way to chop giant pieces of wood is probably to use a big machine, like some kind of giant, say, I don't know, a table saw or whatever. But that means you have to learn how the tool works. And sometimes that can be really annoying. Now, what I advise you to do is avoid the temptation to hacksaw everything and to think smart wherever you can. And often that process involves using a library. Okay? So if you want to use a library, you have to know that the library exists, and you have to know how it works. So how do you use one once you find one? Well, one way is to find a tutorial. You'll find on the web or on YouTube, people will have videos for commonly used libraries, like, let's say, the Django library for doing web programming, right? So out there's, I bet you, dozens of videos on YouTube that explain how it works, and that's great. Now, sometimes you just want to look at the documentation and see how it works in a way that the designers of the library thought was most important. And one of the things that's really nice about Java is that the library documentation is often quite good. So we had here converting string to integer in Java, but we can actually look up the official documentation for the integer class. It's actually usually pretty easy to find. If I just do Java integer, in this case, it takes me straight to this page. And so what I have here is, if we look in this file, it lists everything you might want to know about the integer class. It's all of the interfaces, all of the methods that you might call. And so if we look at this parseInt method, we can see that it tells us what it does. Parses the string argument as assigned decimal integer. So it tells you everything you want to know, and maybe some extra stuff that you don't really care about or quite understand. Now, one thing that's fun about this documentation is even just with what we know so far, just a couple of days of videos, you can already read this. I mean, it says it's a public method. I mean, we know that public seems to be associated with method somehow. Static, well, it's a static method, so you're using integer dot, not like a specific integer. It returns an int, it's called parseInt, and it takes a string argument. And, we don't know what that means quite yet. Oops. Okay, so what I'm going to say here, or what I'm saying here, is just that the documentation is often quite good, and I encourage you to check it out, because sometimes The concise answer in the library is better than trying to dig through a bunch of tutorials on the web. And then lastly, looking at example code snippets that use a particular library is a great technique. And that, for example, is why I love Stack Overflow. Because here, look, a code snippet. So whenever you use those, I do remind you to cite your sources just in line with good practices as any kind of creative person. You should always be citing your sources. And later we'll talk a little bit more about the official rules for citing things in this course. So in 61B, again, we're giving you all the libraries you need. You don't need to get any new ones. And in fact, we ask you not to because it'll make the grader get confused. So for example, if we have not given you the Apache Commons library, don't go use that. Okay. This right here is just a picture of what the integer documentation looks like. But this is a video, so who cares? But if you're a slide reader, and then lastly, I want to let you know a little bit more about the Princeton Standard Library. So I used to teach at Princeton, and one of my colleagues, Kevin Wayne, built this beautiful library for Java that does all kinds of awesome stuff, like getting input from the user, reading from files, drawing, sound, and all of it is a really nice interface. So we're going to make heavy use of it, especially in the early parts of the course. Later on, we'll kind of wean ourselves off of it because it's a non-standard library. But early on, you'll find it's really useful, and especially for Project Zero, you're going to use these heavily because we'll be drawing, planets and all kinds of fun stuff. So next move for you is to go check out Project Zero, get started, and get cracking and really start cementing all the knowledge we have from the video so far. And I encourage you to, before you move on to the next videos, really try and make some major headway on Project Zero, because that's where you're going to learn quite a lot, is actually trying to build things. So that's it for today, and I will see you next time.